Hello, I'm David Bowman, the tutoring coordinator for BCSCR, a project of the Three Rivers Education Foundation. We're going to take a look at what is perhaps the most sophisticated and the most complicated of all of the reading skills that we address in our tutoring sessions, and that is oral language development. When I ask people, how do you define oral language development or oral language skills? When I ask people, how do you teach kids oral language and help them to develop those skills, I get a very wide variety of answers. So it seems both necessary and appropriate that we take a little bit of time and discuss exactly what do we mean when we say oral language development. And what do we know about helping students to develop their oral language skills? And that's what we're going to be doing here for the next few minutes. So first, a very broad understanding of oral language. The broad definition is understanding how language is used in a specific event, setting, context, or culture. Understanding not only the words that we use, but also how we put those words together to make meanings and communicate ideas, and how do we interpret the messages both written and orally from other people according to that event, setting, context, or culture. So that is it very broadly. But as it turns out, oral language is not just a single skill. It's not just here is the name for that thing. Here is the name for that idea. It turns out that oral language is really a combination of 5 different skill sets: vocabulary, syntax, morphological skills, pragmatics, and phonological skills. So let's take a moment and look at each one of these to understand how they together equal oral language skills. So starting with vocabulary. Vocabulary is not only here is what this word means, although that is certainly a part of it, but it's really looking at a variety of spectra around word choice. So on one hand, for example, we have idiomatic language. In this place, in this time, this is what we call this thing. To more universal language on the upper end of the spectrum, which is in the general society, in the general population. Here are what these words mean, and here are what these things are called. Here are the expressions that we use. Here are the language choices that we use. So we're looking from very small context, the local context, to more universal context, the broad society in general. Also the same thing from explicit to metaphorical language. Explicit or discrete language or denotative language is this word has this definition. This word means this thing. This thing is called that word right there. Very explicit. Each word means one thing. But on the upper end of those spectra, we start talking about metaphorical language use, the similes and the metaphors and euphemisms, and basically reading between the lines, here are what the words mean, but the message may mean something different. To nuanced language. So for example, discrete versus nuanced. We can say this box is tiny and describe its dimensions. But we could also say it's puny, which has a very different type of interpretation. It conveys a different meaning. So we go from discrete, tiny, to nuanced, puny, for example. Also, that gives us the range from denotative language use, dictionary definitions, up to connotative use, which also sort of gets us back to that reading behind the lines, where the message being conveyed may be different than what the actual words mean. So this type of learning is something that continues all the way through adulthood, very much the same as an understanding of syntax. Syntax is basically how do we put the words together in a manner that is correct and appropriate to convey a meaning. What is a standard language use? In our case, standard English use. What is the academic language use? What is the appropriate order of words, and how do we change the order of words in order to change our meaning? But in general, when we talk about syntax, we're talking about what are the rules what are the expectations for correct language use in a particular event, setting, context, or culture. This too goes through adulthood. Morphological skills is really the analysis piece here. It's looking at words, word parts, and how we change those parts in order to change the meaning. So, for example, that's going to include suffixes and prefixes and infixes. What is the relationship between the word parts and what do they together mean? But it's also looking the next step broader. How do words interact with one another in order to change meanings? For example, if I were to say, I can only talk about my car versus only I can talk about my car, we're changing the word order, we're changing the way the words interact in order to change the meaning. And that study is the realm of morphological skills. And then certainly looking at how language is used in a particular context also helps to contribute not only to interpreting what people say, but in a reading situation, helping us to interpret what people are writing. That continues through adulthood as well. Pragmatics, the fourth area, is really the what, how, and why of language. It's how we get things done using language, how we accomplish a purpose. But it's also the study of the appropriate language use. We talk one way with our friends and our families. We may talk a very different way or be expected to talk a very different way in a classroom. Well, those are two different cultures. The home and the friends is a different culture than what we have in the classroom. There's different rules, different expectations, different purposes, different behaviors, and so forth. And so pragmatics also includes understanding how language changes according to the event, situation, context, culture, and so forth. Well, when we help students to develop their pragmatics and understand those rules, what we basically help them to do is to effectively communicate ideas and effectively interpret messages that they receive according to the rules and the expectations of that particular environment. So all of that is pragmatics. When we told students, hey, that's not how you say that here. Instead, you need to say it this other way. What we're really looking at there is pragmatics. Now, phonological skills is something that we generally address, birth through the lower grades, because what we're really looking at with phonological skills is being able to identify the sounds of words. From the very earliest ages, breaking sounds apart into whole words, but then also looking at sounds within words. And if we change the sounds within words, can we change the meaning? And what's the connection between sound and meaning here? So that's phonological skills. It's really about the sound. So you see, oral language skills are far beyond how do we call things. It does include 5 very sophisticated levels of skill. And in each of these, we can start at the very simple level with very young children, but at least with 4 out of 5 of these, the learning continues throughout a person's life. So the question is, how do we help to spur this learning? So let's look at some things that we know work for instruction around oral language. The oral language development strategies really fall into 5 categories, or 5 broad strategies, modeling, analysis, practice, correction, and discussion. The first of these, and really your first responsibility with helping students to develop their oral language skills, is modeling. See, when we first learn about language, when we're born, when we first learn how to call things or how to say things or how to ask for things or how to communicate ideas, we really begin to develop that skill through exposure to the language around us. What do we hear? What are the ways that we ask for things? What are the words we use to name things, right? We have that exposure. The exposure leads to a familiarity with language in that particular context, that particular culture, and then we gain an ability to communicate ideas. Your first and primary role then is to make sure that you are modeling appropriate, correct language use. We often talk about the issue of academic language, grammatically correct, using words according to their broadly acceptable word definitions and so forth. And one of the reasons why we emphasize that so heavily is because academic English truly is the language of instruction and the language of assessment. So by making sure that we are providing role modeling in appropriate language use, we give kids the skills necessary to be able to access their instructional texts, and take their assessments effectively and be able to communicate what they do in fact know. So the role modeling piece is absolutely critical in the tutoring environment. Next, the next set of strategies are the analysis strategies. Both word analysis, what are the parts of the word, and how do those parts interact to create meaning, through looking at how words interact, how language is being used by an author or used by a speaker, and then how does the author or the speaker use language in order to convey an intent, to accomplish a purpose, or to communicate a message. So it's really an in-depth study of how language is being used in a reading selection, in a context, a particular situation, and so forth. So that's the analysis piece. So anything around analyzing language usage is going to contribute to oral language development. Now the next two really come together. We've got practice. Kids need practice using language. They need practice expressing their ideas, but at the same time, we want to combine that with correction, because we don't want them to always just practicing inappropriate or incorrect language use. We need to give them actual correction and chances to revise their language use. So some things that we can do. Certainly, we can teach explicit language patterns. Here's how you say this. Instead of pointing at the door and saying bathroom, you can say, may I go to the bathroom? Or can I go to the bathroom? For example, right? So we actually explicitly teach those language patterns. Whenever we ask a child, raise your hands to get my attention, that's sort of leading up to, here's how you accomplish a purpose. To how do you ask a question? How do you make a statement? How do you change what you say or what you write in order to change the meaning? And similarly, on the other side, let's talk about how authors use their language as well, and let's study their language patterns. So some of the other activities that work very well for this, any type of guided oral reading or choral reading is very effective for developing that, for giving opportunities for practice and correction, as does dramatic reading and any kind of revising or rewording. Put this into your own words, or what's another way to say that. All of that fits that set of strategies called practice and correction. But finally, that brings us to the most effective strategy, which is discussion, because this really is the chance for students to wrestle with ideas around language use and interpretation. Gives them a great opportunity to practice expressing their own ideas. But when we are using discussion, we need to make sure that we are addressing increasingly more sophisticated questions and asking more sophisticated questions. Generally, we talk about Bloom's taxonomy, the higher levels of Bloom's taxonomy, but the same holds true for depth of knowledge. Let's make sure that we give kids a chance to explore all those different realms, both asking and answering questions, and then analyzing language use through those discussions. Some things that don't work. Any kind of sustained silent reading, much like sustained silent reading doesn't do much to improve comprehension skills, it also doesn't do much to improve oral language skills. Any kind of worksheets or any type of individual work also doesn't have a positive effect on oral language development, because it doesn't give the chance for that analysis and practice and correction. It doesn't give the chance to interpret others' messages and to communicate one's own ideas. So those really don't contribute to oral language development. So with all that said, you can probably guess which areas that need to be combined with oral language development. When we are working on oral language development, What other reading components do we need to address? Well, obviously, phonemic awareness. That comes out of those phonological skills. Obviously, we're going to combine it with vocabulary instruction. We're going to combine it with fluency instruction, and certainly we're going to combine it with comprehension instruction as we interpret what we are reading and try to determine what is the message being conveyed here. And the primary strategy for comprehension and oral language development is the same. It's those higher level discussions. So really the last thing to say is this is a huge but critical area. This is really where we start moving from just reading text to communication. This is where we start moving from having ideas to sharing ideas, from receiving sounds and receiving text to interpreting and understanding it. So this really is the most sophisticated and perhaps most critical of all of those areas. So your job is a big one here, but I wanted to say thank you. As you help students to wrestle and improve their reading skills, you're not just improving their reading. You really are making a huge difference in their overall lives. So for that, I wanted to say thank you, and I appreciate all the work you do as tutors. So again, my name is David Bowman with BCSCR. Thank you very much, and have a great day.